Dr. Anand, great to have you back. How are you?
I am well, Jonah. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
So, I've always seen you as a look on the bright side of life kind of guy. More of a not in a completely the Monty Python sense, but like um, uh, looking for the optimistic kind of thing. And I've noticed a strain of dyspeptic concern in some of your writing of late, and I figured we should have you on so we could discuss. How do you see things as a keen observer and lover of America?
Yeah, I mean, so you've got my number, all right. I mean, I was very much a rational optimist in the Johann Norberg, Matt Ridley, Steven Pinker school. Uh, but my optimism has taken a bit of a knock with the lockdown and the response to the lockdown, the continuing authoritarianism after it. Uh, Now this really apparently well-sourced talk about World War III and so on. I mean, it's one thing for Trump to say on the brink of World War
Right.
III, but when you're hearing the same thing from generals and serious strategists, so I'm wondering whether we should. I mean, I think you and I were both broadly in the cheerful camp, but I was thinking back to the two great books that defined the 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 optimistic movement, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker and The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. They were both published in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm beginning to think that 2011 may in fact have been the peak, right, of the rule of law, liberty, peace, etc. And it's interesting to look at what has happened since and why.
So it's funny you say that because I have been having this conversation most recently with my wife about how America lost its sense of humor in 2012. And as a historian, you know that 2011, 2012, that's rounding error. That's basically the same moment. And up until about 2012, there were all these sitcoms in American life that could make fun of hypersensitivity to racism, that could make fun of progressives for being so humorless and that kind of thing. And then, like overnight, and this is also around the same moment that Jonathan Haidt, who I think he's not in the rational optimist camp, but he wants to be, right? And because he's data
He's
driven.
he's optimist adjacent.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And he thinks basically the date where we started to ruin all our kids was around 2012 as
Yeah.
well. And so it's just starting to feel, I think you're right, that there is something in the water then. Maybe some of it has to be coincidental because you can't talk about what's going on the international stage and what's going on and the end of TV shows like 30 Rock in the same context. But it does feel like we took a wrong turn around
Mm.
then. And I suspect that some of it, at least in America, has to do with the fact that Barack Obama was reelected, but all the talk about him being this secular messiah who was going to redeem America of its sins and all that went away. And
Yeah.
there's been this bitterness about that in a lot of places. And it also brought out a lot of bad stuff on the right.
So I think this. I think that's very true and important. And the way in which previously apathetic people were energized and involved by the Obama election, which at the time I thought was a good thing. Actually, I'm now beginning to think was a bad thing. The world when everyone was apathetic was actually happier in many ways than the world where people get really very angry and upset about subjects about which they know very little and
Mm-hmm.
or have got the wrong end of the stick. I mean, I think there are two obvious candidates for what began to change around about 2011, 2012. By the way, this isn't just you and me saying that you couldn't make that episode of South Park or whatever. This is
Yeah.
there are measures of this, right? There are various international league tables that look at how is liberal democracy on the increase or is it retreating and so on, and they all identify some turning point round about the first half of that decade when the democratization stopped and began to go into reverse. So I think there are two candidates. One is a cultural shift, that was the real beginning of Twitter, wasn't it? Everyone
Mm-hmm.
suddenly started having these opinions on everything and being defined by their politics in a way that would have been unthinkable before. And I also think that, by the way, was a a playground for foreign propagandists.
Right.
If you're trying to discredit news sources, sow dissension, and delegitimize the US state, Twitter is made for you, right? Twitter and affiliated or similar platforms. The other candidate, though, and this one I think is maybe a little bit underexplored, is the global financial crisis and the reaction to it.
Mm-hmm.
So all of my life, I had listened, ever since I was a student, I'd listened to Marxists saying capitalism is a racket. It isn't a real thing. It's just a word that the rich use to preserve their entrenched interests. It's all about keeping the ruling class on top. And that, all my life until the global financial crisis, seemed to me demonstrably false. It was not a point of view that you could hold in conjunction with the observed facts. But when the bailouts happened, I think we saw something really unexpected, which is that the Marxist critique kind of looked to be a little bit vindicated in the sense that we were taxing low and medium income people to rescue some very wealthy bankers and bondholders from the consequences of their own mistakes. And it really did look as though the whole system was a racket, and to some extent it seemed that way accurately. And so I think that discredited a lot of the norms and values on which the market system had rested. And I think we can trace the descent into more protectionism, less globalization from then. And I'm afraid with that almost always goes a shift towards more aggressive foreign policy.
Yeah, there's a paper that made the rounds a lot at AEI about 10 years ago. It's from the Journal of European Political Science, or European Journal of Political Science, one of these things, where they looked at every financial crisis going back to like 1820.
Yeah.
And found that the kind of financial crises, or every recession going back to 1820, and the ones caused by financial crises of the sort that we had in 2007,
led to authoritarianism.
Led to huge long tails of populism, right? And in retrospect, obvious reasons, right? You feel like you worked hard, played by the rules, and then you got screwed by the elites. If you lose your house over something like that, you don't forget it overnight,
Yes.
And I think that, so I do think there's some structural reasons for that. You did say so. I still wanted to. Only reason why I want to circle back to something you said, because one, I agreed with it, and two, I think I want to write about it now that I think about it, and I don't want to forget about it. So I think this. So as I think you are, I'm a big microcosm versus macrocosm guy in the Hayekian sense, and that like the important things in life are closer to home, and that the rules of the microcosm of friends and family and community can't be applied to the extended order of liberty. You can't get the Gemeinschaft and the Gesellschaft mixed up too much. And so when you said something about how what looked like apathy turned out to be rather healthy, I think this is a really important point to make. Because when pundits and activists bemoan political apathy, what they're bemoaning is that they can't put asses in the seats for their projects.
Right.
And most people who are apathetic about politics aren't apathetic about their businesses, about their families, about the things that actually have meaning in their daily lives. And so for me, it has always been a sign of political health to a certain extent to have low voter turnout, because that meant you didn't feel like you had enough at stake in an election to bother to vote, which is, people saw that as a sign of sickness or lack of civic engagement. In some cases it might be, but in other cases actually, no, we've got better things to do.
Right. It's a great problem to have. You see these historic elections, queues and queues of black and white people together in the first democratic elections in South Africa, or Afghan women waiting under sort of awnings in the shade for the first time. And this is kind of held up to shame us, isn't it?
Right.
Why can't? But actually, I'm thinking, in that situation, apathy is a great problem to have, right?
Right.
Those Afghan women would love to have the luxury of not really needing to bother because, okay, it might very marginally affect, the spending per pupil in school or something, but probably not even that, right? So what a good problem to have. And I think that microcosm versus macrocosm thing, one of my favorite observations was from P.J. O'Rourke, his famous aphorism that everybody wants to save the world, nobody wants to help mum with the washing up, right?
Right.
Wouldn't it be a happier world if, and I say this not just as a father of teenage girls, if people were were a little bit more focused on the practical things instead of getting really very upset about issues that are completely outside their control. So, in the US, there was the first Obama and then the Trump phenomenon. People became very, very polarized by red and blue. Here it was Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
But the coincidence of timing makes me think that actually it would have been something else. If it hadn't been those things, it would have been something else, because we were primed by changes in screen use, changes in education, whatever it was, to become these hyper-political and sort of existentially unhappy, alienated creatures. And that's bad for society, but it's also very bad for the kids who are spending all their time online,
Right.
getting furious about Nagorno-Karabakh or something, which is is not something that any of us realistically can do anything about.
Right. There's a great character in you're Brit, you'll correct me. Is that, I believe it's Bleak House, where Mrs. Jellyby cares passionately about these poor Africans on the banks of some river and does everything she can to raise money to help them, while she utterly ignores her own children who suffer from neglect. And there's always been that. I mean, that's a big part of like the Greta Thunberg-ism, right, thing, which is they lie about, the bumper sticker says act locally, think globally. They want to act globally and not think locally at all, right?
Exactly.
And, it's a unconstrained vision.
Exactly
in
right.
So Wellian way.
You see, I have squirreled away from our last conversation your phrase negative polarization.
Mm-hmm.
Negative for everybody. I mean, obviously, you were using the phrase literally to mean people getting excited about owning the other side. But how negative is that for you? Hatred is never a healthy emotion. It eats away at you. And to be encouraged in this way to define yourself by whom you don't like is, I just think it just makes everybody grumpier. And so I mean, this is something that happened. I observed it very strongly in the immediate aftermath of our Brexit referendum, not in the run up to the vote. That was the funny thing. During the referendum itself, I was out campaigning every day, manning street stalls, campaigning. And, you more often than not, you'd run into the other side with their blue Stronger In t-shirts, and we'd wish each other luck and we'd take selfies together. And it was all a perfectly civil and civilized conversation about, sovereignty, money, migration, law, whatever. After the result came in, it suddenly shifted into being a culture war in exactly your phrase, negative polarization. So it became about whom don't we like? Who are the bastards on the other side whom we imagine to be typical of the other team? And then delete as appropriate, ignorant working class oafs who fell for unscrupulous demagogues, or sneering snobs who secretly hate their own country. Now, I'm guessing that American listeners will recognize something of that division, right? Which makes me think it wasn't really about Brexit. It isn't really about Trump. It's about something else that was looking for a peg on which to be hung. We see the same thing across Europe. We see it in a number of countries. And in a way, actually, the interesting thing is to look at where has that not happened so much.
Mm-hmm.
And the outstanding examples, I would say, of the places that have remained free from this negative polarization to a large degree are the other big Anglosphere democracies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. They are still fairly, with all their problems, they're still pretty civil, democratic polities.
Yeah, although you did see during COVID that trucker strike thing get very American very quickly. But I generally, I think you're probably right about that.
You're right. I just want to explore that for a second, because I'm actually very interested in Canada, and I think the Canadian Tory leader is who
You're the one. I knew there was someone who was really interested in Canada.
The most neglected, fascinating, and actually totally brilliant country. But you would not believe, Jonah, going to a hustings meeting in a riding, as they call them in Canada. I mean, the level of politeness that they all take for granted is, oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you'd finished. Please carry on. Oh, did I misunderstand you? I take that back. I mean, it is beyond anything. And, as you say, this is a country that is very much prone to all of the cultural breezes that blow across the border, on anti-vax, on migration, whatever else. And yet the political system has remained completely solid, immune to all that, almost completely. Nobody seriously thinks that if the other side wins the election, they're going to kind of cancel future elections or impose some kind of dictatorship or whatever. You don't get any of this fear that you get on both sides in the US. None of this lock them up. And I don't know why that is, but one candidate is that because Canada has a constitutional monarchy, no one really has the power to take complete control. There's a referee in the room who says, hang on, this guy obviously won, and here's the limit as to what he's allowed to do. And I wonder whether, that's obviously true of the other two sort of old dominions, the other two Anglosphere democracies, I wonder whether that maybe takes the heat out of politics a little bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory. I'm not sure I completely buy it. I mean, sure, there's something there culturally, right? And maybe there's a chicken or the egg thing, insofar as the culture that built up around a monarchy then also has the monarchy to look to reinforce it sort of catalytically. But like the whole point of the American system was to make it so that no one could have the kind of power to do what they're talking about either. And yet millions of Americans have convinced themselves that the other team, once they get into power, will do exactly that, right? I mean, like the whole point of checks and balances and divided government and faction against faction was to prevent this exactly the fear of tyranny. But the fear of tyranny is friggin' everywhere in America these days. And I think it's, just to confess my priors, I think it is more grounded in reality against from the left aimed at Trump than it is at Joe Biden, because like the critique, and I say this even though the left has cried wolf for a century about Republicans being fascists and would-be dictators. Truman did it to Dewey. They all did it to Goldwater and Reagan. They did it to Bush. And so it pains me as a good right-winger by training and culture to say the Democrats have a point this time about Trump, but I think they have a point this time about Trump. Meanwhile, on the right, people are talking about Biden, the Biden crime family or the Biden regime, doing all of these terrible things, while at the same time they claim that he can't find the bingo parlor at the home, right? You got to pick a lane. Is he a criminal mastermind and would-be dictator, or is he an addlepated, out of it, guy with dementia? He can't be both.
I think that's right, and you have to also allow some empirical data in here, right? In his presidency, Biden has not tried to hack the Supreme Court. He has not tried to admit DC or Puerto Rico to the Union. He hasn't tried to change the Constitution. Again, to borrow another P.J. O'Rourke phrase, he's wrong within the normal parameters of wrong.
Right.
I think that's right. But I mean, you and I have discussed this before. The terrifying thing is not that you have some two-bit Caesarist of the kind that the founders envisaged. It's that you have possibly the majority, possibly a plurality of the population cheering it on. And that's come almost out of nowhere. And so something has changed in people's brain chemistry, right? It may be the way the education system is working. It may just be that the sort of civics that you and I absorbed is no longer there. It may be, it may be related to the fact that during the lockdown, everyone spent too much time staring at screens because there wasn't much else they could do. I don't know. Or it may be, and I really wouldn't rule out deliberate enemy propaganda. There's ample evidence that hostile powers do this, not because they're trying to rig an election, but just because they're trying to make everyone angrier and remove the sense of authority from the whole system. But something has happened in the US, and I fear that the rest of the world may follow. This is another reason why I'm interested in Canada. The leader of the Canadian Conservative Party is in some stylistic aspects populist, in that he frames the battle as ordinary blue collar salt of the earth Canadians against sneering elites. However, his politics are impeccably classically liberal. He is about tax cuts, low inflation, devolution of power, stronger local government, removal of restrictions, making it easier for immigrants to work, all of this kind of stuff. He, if pushed for an opinion, he will allow himself to express the view that women have wombs, right? But he doesn't really, he doesn't focus on the culture wars, right? His main interest is in tax cuts and helping people buy a home. And he is vastly far ahead now in a country which historically has tended to be left-leaning. So I wonder whether there's some lesson there about if you give leadership on the right, if you express the outrage constant in a different way, you give it a different channel. It doesn't need to be statist and strongman cultist. It doesn't need to be about Führerprinzip. It could be about values closer to yours and mine. I mean, the supreme example of this, I think, is probably Argentina, right? Stylistically, Javier Milei is pure Trump. Politically, he couldn't be more different.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. I'm curious. I got dragged into by a friend of mine who was teaching, wanted me to lead a seminar about the rise, the new right's critique of classical conservatism, or I should say the classical liberalism element of conservatism. Adrian Vermeule, these kinds of people. And so I read a bunch of stuff that otherwise I would not have. And I'm just kind of curious, is there any similar post-liberal intellectual murmurings going on in the UK that are similar to the stuff that, because there is a real yeastiness to this intellectually on the American right. I think it's going to fizzle out eventually, but it's a real thing. Is there such a thing over there as well?
Yes. I mean, in no small measure inspired by the people you've just been talking about. But the differences, I think, are instructive. So there was a big NatCon conference here last year, run by a lot of the same people who were involved in the NatCon movement in the US, and with the president of Heritage there, and Yoram Hazony, and a lot of names would be familiar. But the British version was much more, I wouldn't say fusionist, but much more tolerant, much more broad church, in the sense that the organizer here was a lovely man, Cambridge academic and a philosopher, said, look, the minimum entry requirement here is that you believe in national sovereignty. That's the way if you think we're better off in a federal Europe, no, but you've got to believe in the nation state. Beyond that, our differences will be debated and foregrounded rather than hidden. So our differences on immigration, on free trade, and whatever, let's just put all that on stage and make it an intellectually vigorous exercise. So very, very different from what the equivalent meetings are sometimes in the US. I actually spoke at that meeting, and I had the interesting challenge of how do I sell market liberalism to a basically NatCon audience, not entirely. And I don't know whether this was the right thing to do, but I did it by talking about Edmund Burke, who, pin up for all these guys, and quite rightly, a brilliant conservative thinker and the father of the Anglo-American conservative tradition. But a buddy of Adam Smith thought that Smith's book was the best thing he'd ever read. Completely free. The one thing that everyone quotes about Burke, I'm your representative, not your delegate. The issue on which he was disagreeing with the electors of Bristol is that he could see that it was in the interest of Bristol as a whole to allow freer trade with Ireland, even though it was against the interests of some of these producers in Bristol who wanted to get rid of the competition. Right. He was a serious, proper Whig free trader. So afterwards, I had some fascinating conversations with these guys, very polite, clever people in their 20s typically. And I think where they come from is not, it's something that you can reach an agreement on. So usually they would say things like, okay, but what if your free trade ideology conflicts with the national interest? And I would say, well, look, it isn't really an ideology. It's a very practical and pragmatic thing that we've worked out. It's actually quite counterintuitive, but we see that it works. And what I mean by it works is it benefits almost everyone in the nation. So this literally is if by national interest you mean what is best for the nation as a whole, not for some vested interest or producer group within the nation, then this is it. And I think you can persuade people of that. But my goodness, we've got to go back to square one and start, because we've lost a whole generation.
For sure. No, and the my approach to that is to flip it around. It's like, you tell me the exceptions to the rule and we can argue about those, right?
Yeah.
So like nuclear sub manufacturing, okay, let's talk about how free trade has limits there. But avocados, like whatever. Just like we always do it. We always want to start from the premise of you have to prove free trade is good for anything.
Yeah.
Where rather than explain to me the specific things where it's not good for everything, and start there.
But you must have found, sorry, so just on this, you must have found, as I have, that the left are very, very bad at predicting your opinions. They attribute a whole bunch of convictions to you that are a million miles away from what you actually think. And I'm sure we do it the other way around as well, but not nearly as much, for all the clever reasons that Jonathan Haidt has explained and proved in his
We're
book.
better at ideological Turing tests than they are.
If only because we're so marinated in a left-of-center culture that we can hardly avoid some sense of what makes them tick, but the reverse is not necessarily true. Now, I think that is, to a large degree, true of the younger generation of national conservatives when talking about classical liberalism. They attribute beliefs to us that I've never come across in anyone.
Yeah.
Particularly this supposed obsession with materialism and money. And I constantly find myself having to say, guys, I have spent my life around libertarians. I have genuinely never come across anyone who thinks that you get more pleasure from a big bank balance than from playing with your kids or listening to Beethoven or going for a nice walk in the country, right? What we're arguing about is whether that increase in GDP enables you to do all of these other things more. Right? It's not and genuinely, I think that surprises people to learn. They've got an odd caricature of what a free marketeer is.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And the argument ad homo economicus used to be a rhetorical trick of the left. It's increasingly a rhetorical trick of the new right, and it's still a straw man, right? It's still like no one has ever referred to homo economicus as an actual way of thinking about human beings in their full spectrum, right? It's always been about, in a chart, about how they're going to behave when the widgets cost this much and don't cost that much, and that kind of thing. But I do want to...
That's, by the way, that is the classic example. People say, the trouble with your free market economics is that human beings are not perfectly rational. Yes, that's the whole bloody thing that we've been trying to explain.
Right. No, it's the same thing with the checks and balances stuff. Is the whole reason, this is why Irving Kristol used to talk about the American Revolution as a successful revolution, is because it's the only one that ever took human nature into account.
Right.
But I do want to throw something at you in the very short time we have left. I've written about this before. I had a great conversation with Yuval Levin about this a while ago. Edmund Burke's, in the impeachment of Hastings, he has this wonderful speech, the Birds of Prey speech, and where he explains, and I'm open to your correction because you know this stuff better than I do, but he basically explains that, look, what we're doing to the Indians is not good, but what we're also doing to our own young men is terrible. They are learning all the wrong habits of the heart. They're learning all the wrong understandings of how to behave with power, and they're bringing that home. And they become birds of prey over there, and then we're gonna bring them home here. And to me, this is a really important thing that I try to impress upon these young own the libs new writer types, is that the crueler you are to those people, the more you're deforming yourself, the more you are giving into the corruption of hatred. And Arthur Brooks makes this wonderful point about how anger is good. Anger is fine in a democracy. You need anger. When people are doing wrong, anger. But you can get angry at your kids. It doesn't mean you don't love them. Contempt is poisoning to the soul. Yeah. Because contempt says, I know I can dehumanize you, I can unperson you. You can talk about, as Trump does, that people who don't like him are vermin, right? That is, I think, the thing that is corrupting a lot of the politics in America, and maybe it's spilling over there. is the corrupting power of contempt, which gives you permission to do anything and say anything you want to fellow human beings and fellow citizens. And I think that's sort of part of what the Birds of Prey, just tie it back to Burke, was getting at as well, is the habits of the heart that come from thinking that your enemies are not worthy of any respect.
It's such a good point. I think isn't that kind of relationship counseling 101. This is what all the sort of marriage guidance people say. A partnership can take any amount of argument, because if you're arguing, even when you're arguing very angrily, it suggests that you care enough about the opinion of the other person that you want to change their mind, because they're still important to you as another person. It's when you say, "Oh, sod it, she's always doing that. It doesn't matter anymore." That's when it's over, And I think that's a very good point. Something similar has happened in the electorate, and it's a short distance between despising your opponents and thinking of them as enemies. And at that point, you will delightedly go along with removing their civil rights, incarcerating them, whatever, and hence all these lock them up chants at rallies. It's pretty scary.
So there's also something which we don't really have a lot of time to get into, but and you may not have caught this, because I don't know if with the time difference you've been able to spot this on crazy Twitter, but almost overnight, in the last 48 hours, a big chunk of the sort of grifter, crazy, new right crowd have convinced themselves that Taylor Swift is a psyop put forward by the Pentagon and the deep state to set her up as a celebrity so that she can then endorse Joe Biden. And one of my favorite things is that there are an enormous number of people on Newsmax and on Fox talking about how sick and twisted this kind of idolatry is. And in an era, it kind of reminds me of the
Haters gonna hate.
Yeah, it's like the scene in Conan where he says, 2 years ago it was just another snake cult, but now, like this idea that like Trump worshippers who can forgive anything because he's Trump are outraged that people would follow the heat of. And anyway, my only point is, I think the only period in American life that you can look back on and find anything similar is that period of the know nothings.
Yeah.
Where, and people forget that the know nothings were not actually people who knew nothing. That was their response when people asked them about their conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
But that kind of deep, widespread, instantaneous acceptance of conspiratorial thinking, I've never seen it in my lifetime, and I'm really hard pressed to find historical parallels.
Isn't it? But doesn't this really tie back into where you started, which is the politicization of everything?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't it just extraordinary that being a Swiftie is now a political statement rather than an aesthetic or musical statement, right? You made the point that humour stopped in 2012. I mean, actually, in Britain, I think it took a slightly different form, because we have this rather cynical and sardonic side to us, which it can be deeply unattractive, although it can be funny. Politics suddenly became a subject for banter. Everyone had these half-assed takes, these slightly sneering takes that were supposed to be funny on every political event, or every artist, and to the point. I mean, it was a few years ago that Kate Bush came out as a Tory and was so hounded by this that she had to kind of retract and pretend she'd never said it, and what a kind of bizarre, sick world, right? I mean, I long for the days, in a way, and I wish I'd appreciated them more at the time when people would just say, "Nah, not interested in politics. My thing is Formula One," or whatever that thing was.
Right.
Wasn't that great?
I agree. This podcast is called The Remnant for a reason. All right, my friend, I know you have a heart out. You got to go. I could talk to you forever. I hope you'll come back.
You are a great man.